Right now, with Trump's posture, it really gives China that opportunity to double down and to really project itself as the country that is responsible and trustworthy.
I do not see too many countries stepping up to say, okay, the system wasn't working. This is the new system we need. I mean, India might do a little bit of it.
Global Eyes.
Welcome to the second season of Global Eyes. The podcast that rewrites the playbook on geopolitics and security is back with two new hosts. I'm Waslat Hasrat Nazimi, journalist, author, and an expert on migration.
And I'm Shani Rosanas, a commentator and producer at Deutsche Welle, covering international politics and security, and especially with focus on the Middle East. And together, we're here to break down complex geopolitical issues and amplify voices that too often remain unheard.
And today we're exploring a major global shift. It's been only a couple of months or weeks maybe since Donald Trump got back in the White House, but his policies are already reshaping international relations. For the so-called Global South, we don't really like this term, but more on that later. Trump's presidency presents both opportunities and significant risks. While up-and-coming powers like India or China may find new diplomatic openings, many people living in vulnerable states fear devastating consequences.
Exactly. Trump's diplomacy isn't just about deals. It's also about disrupting the international order and U.S. setup of it. And the critics say that Trump is undermining human rights, weakening the United Nations, and drastically affecting global refugee protections.
And these consequences aren't abstract for millions of people. They're real and immediate. Changes in U.S. policy under Trump are having ripple effects on refugees, displaced populations, and marginalized communities worldwide.
Well, before we dive right in, because there's a lot on this topic, we want to first share our thoughts on things that have happened recently, a little segment we called A Moment to Mention.
Yeah, there's so many things happening that we can't all touch upon, but some things I think we have to bring up. And Shani, what's happening? What's on your mind?
Germany has a new parliament. It was voted in just recently. And what happened was that there was actually a drop in women participation in the parliament. And it's always bad, it's always sad. We always want to see more representation of minorities and women if we're technically not a minority, but are, marginalized often. And it made me realize, okay, let me research a bit. Where do Germany stand in the world? And Germany is ranked place 44 in the world in women representation in the parliament.
Wow.
And if you look at the top countries that are there, they are all what we call global South countries. You have the top is Rwanda, but you also have there at the top Nicaragua and Mexico and Cuba. And I think, we here at the West, when we look at the global South, there's always this patronizing, often a patronizing look and feeling like we've got it. We know our where how
we
to
have
get
to
things
educate
done.
people on feminism.
Exactly. And then you're thinking, well, actually some humility and some proportion of understanding, the bigger challenge that are still out there could not hurt. Let's say put it that way.
Yeah.
What's with you, Vaslat? Anything on your mind?
I think something that not surprised me, but shocked me very much was the defunding of international media outlets in the U.S. or U.S.-backed international media outlets like Voice of America and RFERL or Radio Free Europe. Maybe also because my mother used to work at RFERL, so I have a very deep connection to them. And I think it's also because we work for Deutsche Welle and they're basically the American version of Deutsche Welle.
Correct.
So this really touched me. And it's also very troubling for not only vulnerable countries, but democracies worldwide. So
I think you're right. It's just about making the linkage, the great connection between free media and independent media.
Yeah.
And as another pillar that builds and strengthens democracy and the lack of seeing that as such. I think what we're seeing in the world right now with the rise of populism, and we see that connection to the rise in fake news and misinformation, I think there's no way around that. You have to understand that free media is an important component of having free societies and democratic societies. I think this is just one of the policies that, Trump has been taking and are unraveling the world that we're living in. And I think it's a good chance to bring our guest to discuss further on that topic and the Trump effect on the world we're living in.
Our first guest is Ambika Vishwanath. She is the founder director of Kubernein Initiative and a research fellow at La Trobe Asia. Both of our guests actually today are at the Raisina Dialogue conference, which is a security conference in New Delhi hosted by the Observer Research Foundation. and the Indian government, where I'm sure they've picked up valuable insights that will enrich our discussion.
Well, thank you for joining us, Ambika. Welcome to our show. Maybe just start with telling us right there in Delhi now, what are people thinking about the first months of the Trump 2.0 presidency?
Yeah, hi, good afternoon, and thank you for having me on this show. What are people saying is probably not very different from what you're hearing back in Europe as well. There's a lot of, from the Europeans, you hear a lot of shock and awe. I heard some of that when I was in Munich at the Munich Security Conference just about a month ago. I think the Europeans are not yet over that shock that they got with the vice president's speech. There's definitely been more of that over here as well. We had Ms. Tulsi Gabbard was here yesterday in a conversation on the main stage. So there was some comments from her that didn't, I think, sit well with some people in the audience. But from an Indian perspective, we're definitely on a wait and watch holding pattern, I would say, to a certain extent. We have, for now, a pretty good relationship with the US and with this administration at the highest level. What that could look like just months down the line, it's hard to say, because if this administration is one thing, it is unpredictable, I think, in some senses, right? We will have some amount of tariffs as well. That discussion is coming up over here. What that means for India is something we need to see. But we have other countries from, and there's I'm not sure of the exact number, but I would say there's probably close to 100 countries represented here at Raisina in some form or the other. And there's definitely mixed reaction. You have, and I agree with the both of you, I also hate the term the global south, right? It's not a monolith for everything. But you have more developing economies having a different reaction to the presidency on one side, but to the cutting of aid and programs on the other side. And then you have middle economies like Australia. Their reactions are a little bit different. So it's very mixed, but it's also very reactive right now because things are moving so fast coming out of America. So in that sense, I would say more reaction than proactive movement at this point.
Maybe because we're talking about the Raisina Dialogue, it's a good chance to also bring our next guest that is joining us today. It's Zsuzsa Anna Ferenczy. She is an affiliated scholar from the Department of Political Science at the Free University of Brussels. She's also an assistant professor. Her expertise are China, Taiwan, and EU relations. And I want to ask you, Zsuzsa, the title of this show is Trump Good to the Global South? I mean, looking at what you're hearing in the last days in the Raisina Dialogue, is there also hope? Is there also new excitement that maybe good things can come out from the Trump presidency?
Thanks, Shani and Vaslat. Thanks for having me on the show. And it's really good to actually join the conversation from Delhi together with Ambika. We are at the Raisina Dialogue. So as a European, obviously, I'm very curious to see how things are really playing out on the ground here, because the conversations are often very different in Europe, in the Brussels bubble, as we often say, and in other parts of the global south, or the so-called global south, a term that I equally think does not really reflect the reality. And actually, if we stick to the term, then I think the answer to your question in terms of how this plays out, it really depends on where you are and how you see development. So I travel a lot in Southeast Asia, and we know that ASEAN is also a very diverse union. Obviously, the level of integration between its members is quite different from the EU's level of integration. But I would say that even in a small, relatively speaking, small region, because it's just 10 countries, I'm using this as an example, even there, the impressions will be very different. And then if you move towards East Asia, and you see that the perceptions of what an assertive China means and how the US-China rivalry will play out with Trump back in the White House, there you will see, I would say, a convergence in the sense of urgency between, say, Japan, Korea, Taiwan. But then if you move forward south, or if you move to Latin America and Africa, again, there's a huge diversity. So I think what we need is really to unpack, and I'm glad you're doing this in today's show, And it's really good to have in part of the conversation, really the diversity of views that come from people who live in the region, as Ambika and I myself, that I've had this privilege to really in East Asia, based in Taiwan at the moment, and engaging in these conversations there.
Thank you, Zsuzsa. Let's start with one country. I want to present to you and to the audience the highlights of a survey held by the European Council on Foreign Relations shortly before Trump stepped back to the White House, showing many people outside of Europe are upbeat about the second Trump presidency. In India, for example, 84% feel Trump is good for their country. What are they seeing that the West does not see, Ambika?
I'm not sure I can answer that question. I would not probably have been in that 84% grouping. I mean, I don't know if people outside of the traditional Western bloc would be upbeat, but I do think that a lot of countries, especially developing middle economies, I wouldn't say lower middle economies in terms of development sector, but middle economies are more hopeful in that the shakeup that the Trump presidency is bringing to global systems and the global order, global trade, and what have you, might prove beneficial to them in the short and medium term, right? And I think that is what they're trying to look at. I think they might see some pushback to China. I think they're hoping for some greater pushback to China in that sense. I'm not sure that that's actually going to happen. And I also feel like they are hopeful about the fact that for too long, global systems have been dictated by a small group of countries. I mean, this is not new, right? We've heard this time and again, voices from India, but voices from other parts of South Asia. I live in Australia for the moment, and you hear around the Pacific as well. People have been asking for a change in how we conduct our global governance. And I think the hope is that this will now shake up that system. Whether that's going to then create a system that's actually beneficial to all of these countries that are hopeful, I'm not so sure at this stage, right? Maybe 6 months down the line or 2 years down the line, we might see things differently. But at this point in time, knowing what we know, I don't think that that's a reality. In India, I would say that probably the people that are hopeful are the ones that are looking at long-term engagement with America on more tech engagement. We're likely to see more engagement on our nuclear agreement, more engagement in just positioning India as a rising or perhaps very soon risen global power. And so I think in that sense, because also we have at the very highest level between Modi and Trump, there is such a strong relationship. India sees that as something that will insulate us from all the other shocks that are being felt elsewhere. But beyond that, I'm not sure. Yeah. I do not know what the 34% thing.
Yeah, and we know Modi was one of the first foreign leaders to visit Trump in the White House, and in what seemed to be a good meeting. But I think what will be the test of it is that we will be seeing Trump announcing his new tariff plan on April 2nd. And it could be, we've also seen the White House press talking about, they are not happy with the tariffs that India has on American goods. And this might be coming, head to head soon enough. We will see that. But you're talking about the shakeup and how there's a welcoming, approach to that. And I want to ask you, Zsuzsa, when things shake up, they're going to have to eventually fall into a new place. And in this new order that we will be seeing, can it be that the Europeans will take over the void left behind the Americans?
Well, you're asking all the right and difficult questions, because I think the question is, can it and does it want to? Meaning, can Europe have that capacity? And what do the rest of the world want? I mean, what are the expectations of Europe? Because I think when it comes to our record as a global player, as a geostrategic power, as that was the ambition a few years ago, I think not many people are happy with our record in terms of really living up to that self-imposed label that we are, because indeed we are, globally speaking, the largest global trading bloc. And I think the expectations are there, but I don't think that we have been able to really project ourselves. And I just want to pick up on what Ambika said about India positioning itself in this new dynamic that we see globally. And I think that's what every single country is trying to do, to position themselves vis-a-vis the US and China. But there's a lot more to it, right? There is the China-Russia factor together. And I think every country has to kind of rethink how they position themselves. And for Europe, this is going to be obviously the big question, but perhaps the most difficult question because of the nature of the EU as 27 sovereign countries. And so whenever I'm in Asia, Southeast Asia, whichever part of the Indo-Pacific, and I get this question, just like you asked me, how will the EU position itself? And I always ask, well, first we need to remember and we kind of be clear about what the EU is and what we expect from it, because the EU is not the United States. It is still 27 countries that now I think perhaps there is the ambition and perhaps also an opportunity to strengthen this internal convergence that will be indispensable for us Europeans to be taken seriously, and more importantly, to kind of regain the trust of countries in the developing world that feel that we haven't really been honest. And that's why, and that's where we are, that they are looking for alternatives. And perhaps we can get there later, but I guess the China factor is something that we cannot leave out of this conversation. So for now, I think we're still waiting to see how things will play out.
Yeah, and Europe is all about hard power and defense these days.
So we see a lot of topics that are coming up, and as Václav said, hard power is the game in Europe, the strong game. But there's also the effect of soft power, and for our purposes, and definitely when we talk about the American engagement, or what would say the withdrawal of engagement, would be aid and international aid, and the way this is soft power is being used, and Afghanistan is definitely a place where America has tried for a very long time with very little success to exert both hard and soft power. Where does it find itself now under, 2 months into Trump and many more, 3+ more years to come?
Yeah. So we're speaking about Afghanistan because I was born in Afghanistan, Ambika and Zsuzsa, just for your information. And basically, I'm also working in the Afghan department right now as well. The thing is, after 2021, after the Taliban took over, or they were basically given the country by the US, the US was still the biggest country to give aid and to fund Afghanistan, especially because Afghanistan is going through a humanitarian and social crisis right now. So many people are affected by it. So millions of dollars were still flowing into the country. And now that with the US aid freeze, it has created a huge problem because so many health centers had to close down. It had a huge effect on people, but also women. Like there was a group of women in Oman that I read just a few days ago who were on scholarships, and now they have to be sent back because it was the only way for them to get education. So Afghanistan is, I think, one
is always
example.
A challenge for Afghan women, as it is.
Yes. But let's bring our guests back. Ambika, you deal extensively with aid and the effects of the cuts in USAID are having on the global south. Is there any way to turn this moment into something good? What do you think?
Because let's admit it, there were many flaws in the system as it was. Trump is banking on that, but instead of reforming it, he wants to scrap it all together.
I'd like to answer that question, but also sort of react a little bit to what Zsuzsa had said earlier, right? The question is constantly, and it's here in Delhi. It's been at the Munich Security Conference a month ago, and it will be for months down the line. What is Europe going to do now, right? And while the many countries around the world are, as we have established, possibly celebrating in some form or the other, or welcoming the shakeup that the Trump presidency is bringing, and asking then what Europe will do. I think the question to ask over there as well is, what is the rest of the world going to do, right? If we are going to, we've already seen $44 billion now taken out of the system because of US aid. We've also seen budget cuts coming from the UK. We're going to expect more of it from the Europeans and other countries as well. Australia will have elections coming up in May. Depending on how that goes, there could be cuts over there as well. We might, on the one hand, say, okay, the Trump presidency is bringing up change that is required in the global governance systems. The Europeans are not ready, I think, to step in and pick up the mantle on some of those issues. So then who's going to step in? What happens 2 years down the line when we are seeing the cascading risks of this shakeup? I do not see too many countries stepping up to say, okay, the system wasn't working. This is the new system we need. I mean, India might do a little bit of it. Australia is probably going to do a little bit. Japan, we might see the BRICS as a grouping do a little bit, maybe ASEAN in its neighborhood. But I do not see any sustained momentum or any sustained movement to say, this is what the new system should look like that's going to be beneficial to all. No one beyond a point is going to say, okay, the Indian system is going to be beneficial to all on a global scale, right? I have no qualms about that. But what is going to happen? And I think in that, I will then add on to your question. I agree that, yes, the US aid probably was in many ways a slightly over bloated bureaucratic system, and it did need change. Many aid agencies around the world have gone through change over time, and it is required. But this was not the way to do it. It could have been done in a much more phased fashion, perhaps where you did a more systematic evaluation of the projects. I know in India itself and in South Asia, of several projects that were probably running that just did not have any positive effect at all. In fact, they probably weren't doing anything useful. Those could have been evaluated and money directed in a more effective fashion. But this is how it's happened. Now, who's going to step up and spend all of that money? The WHO is looking at, I think they said 1/4 or 1/5 budget cuts. UNDP is looking at budget cuts. All of these agencies are looking at budget cuts, right? Who's going to step up and spend all of that money? Or 5 years later, are we going to be dealing with a whole host of other problems? I think that's the question we need to be asking.
Well, maybe that's a chance also to bring you, Zsuzsa. I mean, any chance China might want to step in and start seeing that also as a tool in its diplomatic arsenal?
Absolutely. I mean, that's a good question and an easy question to answer, meaning that it's a simple yes. I mean, also, we have to remember that we are discussing change, and I think it's important. And I do believe that what will happen in the coming years is not so much going to be defined by what Trump and China do, say, like as in the US-China rivalry, but how countries respond to that. And that's, I think, what we're seeing right now. And I think we're seeing countries being ready to push back and to assert their sovereignty and their agency more forcefully. And we also have to say, just as Ambika said, that people have been asking for change for a long time. So what we're seeing right now is not necessarily new, but we definitely see an amplification of that demand for change. And also with Trump's return to the White House, we clearly things have rapidly taken up speed. But I would go back to at least a decade when China, under the leadership of the current Chinese leader, Xi Jinping, the narrative coming out of China for over 10 years has been that the West is in decline. The system of global governance that we have is not functioning. Countries feel left behind. And there is China that projects itself as the solution provider. And this has been ongoing, supported by China's different initiatives, such as the Belt and Road Initiative, but more recently, other initiatives, such as the global security, global security, global development, and global civilization initiatives. So there's a series of tools that China has been actively promoting, and I wouldn't say without success. I would say that China has successfully managed to undermine the presence and the influence of, say, Western liberal democracies in developing countries where there has been a strong demand for an alternative. And I do see that right now with Trump's posture and it's his behavior and the way he's using this second presidency to make America great again, it really gives China that opportunity to double down and to really project itself as the country that is a responsible and trustworthy trade partner that does not weaponize trade to its own interest. Although all of this is debatable, and I'm not saying that this is the case necessarily, but I am just speaking as I see it through a European lens, how I understand Beijing's behavior and posturing. And definitely, I also see in the global south countries feeling like the time has come for this change, and they are more open to such an alternative. But again, Ambika, you also asked the right question. What this new order going to be like? I mean, I keep saying that it is an alternative, but I think no one really knows. And Europeans, perhaps we expect Europe to step up and take on that role to champion fundamental values that are at the core of what the EU stands for, as initially established as a peace project. But clearly, the world has changed. So again, I circle back to what I said earlier about the change that we're living and how we see countries take advantage of that at their own benefit, often at the cost of others. And I'm afraid that developing countries will not be much happier with China taking leadership. But we can discuss that again, why I say that.
Yeah, Ambika, do you directly want to comment on that? Because you...
Yeah.
Definitely,
China will want to step up. It'll say everything that Zsuzsa is predicting over here, right? That we are a safe partner, we are a trustworthy partner. But even the incidences of the last few years will tell us. Sri Lanka is an interesting case over here as an example, right? Of what could happen if you put all your eggs in the China basket. And some form of diversification is useful. But if everyone doesn't want to go the China route, and there will definitely be countries that will go that way, then what else?
Is India maybe?
I mean, does everybody really want the India experiment? I'm not so sure that works for everyone either. And I think that's where the crux of it lies, right? Do we want one particular example to be the experiment for everyone? And let's take what's happened in the last 65, 70 odd years is the Western example that's been now what has led the global governance systems.
The whole issue is coined by a premise of one big superpower taking the lead. This was in America, and now we're saying, okay, who would be the next superpower? But what are the chances that we will actually see a whole new constellation?
Yeah, if I didn't just complete my thought over there, I think that's where I was kind of going to go, right? The India way is to sort of promote more unilateral multilateralism, if that makes any sense. But many things in India take time to understand and make sense to other people. But Zsuzsa has been coming here for years, so she understands, I think, what unilateral multilateralism means. And perhaps that is the way to go, where we have more voices from different parts of the world that bring very unique contexts to creating a system that will be beneficial to all. However, that will have a very transactional undertone. And I feel like whether we are prepared or not, that's the way we're going to go forward, at least for the foreseeable future, is whatever happens, there will be that transactional undertone underpinning how we
Ambika, maybe just for our viewers and listeners, can you explain minilateral? What exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah, so India is in very much, and it's not just India, I would say a lot of growing economies now are in favor of unilateralism, which is small groupings working within small groupings. So the Quad, for example, as a quadrilateral, is an example of a minilateral framework. I would also argue ASEAN, the BRICS, the G20, to a certain extent, can be argued as a minilateral framework in some ways. So moving away from the very large multilateral frameworks that is what led to the creation of the UN and then our UN systems, the G77, and then various other formats that we have right now. So India will be very proud to say that, on the one hand, we are part of the Quad, but we're also part of the SCO, and we work with our partners based on what we need.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that we're going through a lot of transformations.
Definitely. I want to ask one last question. Zsuzsa, how do you think the European attitude toward China may have shaped the relationship with the EU and other countries in Asia, in Southeast Asia? I mean, could it be that maybe warming up now to China with the US stepping back could help also shape these relationships and make them maybe better, closer allies?
Well, that's an important question. I think there will be not a tendency, perhaps a temptation to look at China as the more trustworthy partner because we can no longer rely on the United States. But I think this is not something that I really expect to play out as smoothly as perhaps Beijing is betting on. For China, Europe is a very valuable and important partner. So we have to remember that both sides are equally engaged in this important relationship this is still the reality for Europe. China remains an important partner. But I would also say that for Europe, I think for long, perhaps for decades, for too long, for sure, we have looked at the Asia Pacific region through a China lens. And I think we've projected our understanding of the region through that lens where everyone else was ignored on the European agenda. And I think that started to shift as we have shifted our perceptions of China, seeing it more as a security threat, and also our over-reliance on China has really pushed us to see India more, to see ASEAN countries more. And I think this is the reality we live in. And I think this is appreciated very much in these countries. I also have to say, though, that perhaps, I truly believe that this is the direction. And if this is kept, it is positive. However, I think it will take a lot more effort from the Europeans to shift that perception and to really see, for example, our partnership with Indonesia, not through that China lens, because for Indonesia, China is an important partner. And if you go and you speak to the government or civil society or think tanks, what they will hear is that you as a European want to make sure that Indonesia decreases its cooperation with China and Europe gets more attention. And this is something that is not appreciated. And I think we're still really just learning how to do that. And I think the initiatives that we have put out, and let me just mention the Global Gateway, because it's being projected as Europe's response to the Belt and Road Initiative, meaning we are bringing the solutions that China claims it has brought. Some countries have paid a much bigger price for that, as Ambika mentioned, Sri Lanka. But I think this framing of the Global Gateway as a response to the BRI is not the right framing, because again, it just reflects exactly what I'm saying. Well, the competition is unavoidable, but again, that we see these countries as an object, not as our partners that we want to work with. So to come back to a question you had earlier in terms of how this changes, where this change is taking us, I think, and the minilaterals, I think these are coping mechanisms in a way, to deal with the competition, where each country can assert its interests and push back against that competition, because definitely competition is a core dynamic in this dynamic change that we're seeing.
Ambika, if you would have to guess, is that a good thing? Are we approaching a more, let's say, less dangerous world? Is it something that it could be a chance for us as well?
I work on a daily basis on climate and security, so I'm not sure we're approaching a less dangerous world at all. But I feel like, and I definitely agree with Zsuzsa on the fact that the movement towards these minilaterals is very reactive in nature. Whether it's going to work for everyone the way it's been working for a few countries, it depends on how you instrumentalize that with your within your domestic space. And some countries have done it, I think, quite successfully. Not everyone yet. But it's also important to understand that and there's a point again, Zsuzsa made that, countries are not there just to be um, recipients of whatever your domestic policy is. They need to be seen as more than that. They're not just for aid or for selling your goods and services. They have their own goods and services. They have their own partnerships to offer, their own ideas and innovation. I think some of the innovation coming out of Southeast Asia, for example, and East Asia is amazing. So we need to really consider what's happening in other parts of the world, and in how we then create new conversations just to begin with, right? Before we even do anything beyond that.
But Ambika, what you're saying makes me think maybe there's an upside to the world we're going into, because then when you do have, even if you're a small country and you have a good amount of natural resources and minerals, then you have a stake in the game. You have a voice now that maybe before was much harder for you to use, and maybe in a way, I'm also thinking a lot of Trump as this big disruptor, but maybe tearing off the masks is a good thing. We're talking about the need to bring more honesty into world system and world order. Maybe we can look at that as something that can actually help us, be more clear in this is what it is. And now with this, unlike hiding maybe behind words about
democracy,
shared values and democracy,
feminism.
many things that, Afghanistan lessons have taught us sound very good, but de facto in nation building crumble very fast. And maybe there's an upside to that.
Yeah, Shani, I would only say you are already bought into the Indian system of doing things. So,
all right, good to know.
And me, I have the Chinese app, so I'm on the Chinese side.
Yeah. All right.
All right. Great discussion so far, but unfortunately, we have to come to an end. Shani,
but we have to talk
about
right?
We
have this global south that we've been using scarcely, but we have been using. And there's really a big problem with this term. You all agree on that, partially because, of course, it's not a monolithic body. We're talking about anything between 70 to 130 nations in different sizes and different history, culture, geographically spread around the world. And I was looking into several alternatives that are out there. I asked ChatGPT to help me.
Nice
with that. And also, traditionally, these were the countries that, were called during the Cold War. They were called, I'm just giving a slight background for our audience. They were called what we call Third World, because the First World was the West, the Second World was a communist world, and the Third World were everybody else, the non-affiliated one. And then later it turned into the developing countries. And there's still a struggle of how to bring together, how to label this very diverse, non-monolithic bunch of countries. And so one of the examples that I actually prefer and liked, and many of the examples go into economics, so it's the developing countries or emerging countries or low and middle income countries. I think it only tells one part of the story.
I agree.
One of the offers that I actually liked better was majority world, which I think puts a better perspective into understanding where the majority of the population live and where majority of countries lay, because they're not in the West. Another option that I prefer better is maybe the post-colonial nations, even though, again, not always accurate. But I feel like it gives better background into what is the historic burden of that these countries are carrying that are still shaping the dynamics of power. Because going into global south, I find it to be so neutral, sort of pitting it on random geographic reasoning as if this is the only problem. So this is just some of...
And you know what? I remembered a few minutes ago, I think I met Ambika at the Munich Security Conference last year. And I think we spoke about the same topic because I interviewed her on the perspective of the Global South. And she was like, I don't like this term.
So Ambika, what would be your
Ambika.
preferred term? How do you avoid this, or what is your solution?
What's that? I do remember that, and I was wondering if that was you, but I wasn't sure, so I said I will I'll ask you later. Um, I don't think we should have one single term. I think it has to be context driven now. And as somebody who works a lot on climate, the kind of climate hazards that we're seeing, let's take heat or let's take fire, right? China, parts of China, Canada, northern India, and Australia, the way we look at the wildfires, they're all exactly the same, right? So look at heat, look at so various other like so if we look at climate, I feel like we should be very context specific. Are we talking about tech? Because in creating one grouping, even if you say majoritarian, it's automatically then an othering in some way or the other. And I'm a little bit hesitant to do that. Also, I'm a little bit hesitant, I think, as a woman to create a term that has a sense of othering in some ways or the other. So
Hmm. Good
maybe
point
we
there.
say it for some context from an economic perspective. But if we are saying tech, there's some amazing tech that's coming out of countries in Latin America and also in East Asia, obviously India, and not so much in Europe. So I think we need to make it a little bit more context specific. I mean, that would be my option, ideally.
Zsuzsa, what's yours?
Yeah, I think, yeah, it's tricky to use labels because often these labels are those that we self-impose. And let me just bring in the European normative power label, which is what what the EU kind of has used for the past decades to project itself as this global power that pursues values and not interests. And of course, this was again made for a different world. So now in 2025, when we use the global south term, I think the idea behind this is, and it's a loosely used term, is to really emphasize the economic dimension, as you said earlier. But I also find it very interesting that we are so careful how we use the term, but then we have the Prime Minister of India who uses the term very comfortably, saying that India is the voice, the leading voice of the global south. And in that case, the label is used in a positive way from Delhi's perspective to really be and to project itself as the next leader that listens to the needs of the developing countries, in contrast with perhaps Western countries that have a bad record or a difficult record. And I think just on the last thought on India, I think it's also very important that this is also projected as not an anti-West idea, but a non-West
West.
idea. And this is very much different from what comes out of Beijing and Moscow as being anti-West / post-Western systems of global governance that they bring a solution to. So I think we could have another podcast on this, but I thought it was interesting. And again, I use these terms as a European, so I'm just like you, sitting in Europe right now. I think we come from different places, and I think it's unavoidable that we see and we see these terms through our own lens and our own upbringing and cultural dynamics. And I think we have to be careful how we project those on other countries. So I'm glad that we're having this conversation today. I appreciate it much.
And thank you for joining us for this great discussion. And if our viewers and listeners, audience, anybody has some ideas, please share it with us in the comments.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to our guests, but we really must go now. Ambika and Zsuzsa, thank you for this fascinating conversation. We'll continue monitoring these developments closely. Clearly, Trump's presidency is a double-edged sword for countries traditionally labeled as the global south. While it offers opportunities for powerful nations to reposition themselves geopolitically, for vulnerable states and communities, the risks to human rights, refugee protections, and international stability are significant.
And that leaves us and you, our listeners, with a crucial question. Who benefits most from the world where international norms and rules are weakening? Is this truly an opportunity for more autonomy, or does it make the world less safe for those most in need of protection?
What do you think about Trump's global impact? Does it create new opportunities or deepen existing inequalities? Let us know.
Yeah, we'd love to hear your thought and reach out to us online. That's it for today, our episode of Global Eyes. I'm Shani Rosanas.
And I'm Waslat Hasrat Nazimi. Thanks for listening and stay tuned for our next episode where we will unpack another key geopolitical issue. Take care.
Global Eyes, a new take on security policy by DW.